Hello, my name is Kate Strickland, and I will be talking to you a little bit about Greek columns. Now, Greek columns, they aren't just a thing of the past, they're still relevant, they're very much still being used in architecture, and even as far as architecture has come, the basis of most structures still comes from Greek columns. Another name for Greek columns is the classical order, as it is better known in architecture. And the reason that I decided to do this is simply because Greek architecture is something that is often spoken about, but has never really gone into detail with, even when it comes to Greek mythology. Like, you hear surface level things, you hear about the temples and how they were made for the gods and designed after the gods, but you never really get to see the details in the design that goes behind this. I did this for Dr. Thompson's Religion 495 class, and I hope that throughout this you just get a deeper understanding of what the columns are, the reasons that they were used, and most importantly that you just get to see how they're still relevant today and that you should still care about Greek architecture because it still impacts our society. So the first point that I want to get to is the historical background. And as I mentioned, yes, like Greek architecture is always just talked about and it's always relayed with how the columns came to be and those kinds of things. But it's important to point out that columns, or orders as they're more formally known, were used in Greek architecture, but they date back a lot further than the Greeks. To start off, just one of the specific cultures I wanted to point out that used columns prior to the Greeks were the Egyptians. The Egyptians had pyramids and temples and burial sites and all kinds of just construction that dealt with columns way before the Greeks. That being said, Egyptians used different shapes and sizes and material from the material that columns are associated with now. They started off with Tuscan columns, which are columns that were just plain and they were just based for the sake of keeping structures together. They were firstly made from clay, then they moved on from clay to wood, and as popularly used by the Egyptians, limestone, and then from limestone we get what we know and associate with the Greeks, which is marble, which is a lot more long-lasting, a lot more durable. An example of an Egyptian column that we still have preserved to this day is the Hypostyle Hall, which is composed of 134 limestone columns in the form of papyrus stalks, and it dates back to Ramses II, circa 1279. It is said that Hypostyle Hall was constructed under the watch of Ramses in his first year of reign. Now, here is an example of some of the columns that is found in Hypostyle Hall. And as you can see, they are quite plain. Besides the hieroglyphics that are there, there isn't much to them. There's not a specific base, and they kind of look a lot more like Doric columns, which I will get to in a little bit. And one of the really cool things about the columns that are present is that the hieroglyphics aren't just there for nothing. They depict rituals and sacrifices that were commonly done by the Egyptians. And what's really special about Hypostyle Hall is that Ramses II had himself drawn into these hieroglyphics and going through his rituals and going through his practices, his religious practices. And one of the things is that he was actually buried at this very site And Hypostyle Hall is found in the Djoser's complex, which is one of the first step pyramids that was ever created. The entrance is full of columns, and as was said, there was only one entrance. It was located on the southeast corner, from which a spectacular colonnade hall whose columns are partly sculpted in the masonry. Beyond the open colonnaded courtyard was the great hypostyle hall with immense columns arranged in a central nave and side aisles. That being said, what the Greeks really did was just take these original designs of the Tuscan columns popularly used by the Egyptians and the Mayans and evolved them into the ones that we know now. And so they evolved the ideas of a post and shaft about 700 BC, and they were made into the classifiable orders that we associate with Greeks. So the Dorian or the Doric column is actually the first column that we have to be recorded after it's been maturely developed. So it's usually given the title of the original Greek column. But that being said, both the Doric and the Ionic styles developed around the same time, which is contrary to common belief. So although there are 5 different classical orders that are associated with columnar design, I chose 3 main ones, and they are the Doric design, as I mentioned, the very first recorded design, the Ionic design, and the Corinthian design. So Doric columnar structure dates back to as early as 590 BC, where it was used in a temple called Hieraeum at Mount Olympia. Doric columnar structure stands without a base, which is different from the Tuscan column, The earliest form of this style of columnar structure, they were thin, and it wasn't until recent styles that the design was thicker in diameter and longer. The shaft at the top of the column is typically divided into 20 flutes. Flutes are shallow grooves that are carved into the surface of the shaft, and this all comes together with a capital. The capital is the crowning member of a column, so it is the very highest point of a column. It is made of annulets, which are small bands, with an abacus, which is a flat slab at the top. The cornice is about 1/3 of the column, and above it is a vertical face, which is adorned with more crowning. Here's an example of the Doric order, and as I said, Doric order came after the Tuscan order, which did not have a base and didn't have much of a design at all. So the Doric order, as you can see, the flutes are wider, they have a flat top, there's no base, typically found on the 3rd step of a temple or a burial site, depending on how they wanted the building to be constructed. And some of the older buildings that we have that incorporated Doric order are the Basilica, which is circa 550. Then we have the Temple of Poseidon, circa 560. And there are many more examples. All right, so moving on from that, we have the Ionic columnar structure, and it was first used in Ionia, Greece, hence why it got the name Ionic. The Ionic shafts, they do rest on a base, a round base, and its flutes are a lot more thin and flat compared to that of the Doric columnar structure. The capital is marked by a pair of volutes, which is an upside down scroll, but the Greeks meant for the volutes of the Ionic columns to look like the shape of what a sea urchin would look like. On each face of the column, you can find a volute. So here's the capital, and then you have one volute here and one volute there, and they come down together, and you get this. Here is an example of what an Ionic column would look like. As you can see, the flutes are a lot more present. There are more of them, and they're a lot thinner. You can see the volutes at the top, and that it has a base, which if we go back to the Doric order, there is no base. It kind of looks girthier compared to that of the Ionic columns, which, as you can see, is a lot more elegant in its completion. The last order that we will talk about is the Corinthian columnar structure. And this columnar structure was first introduced in the 5th century. Its uniqueness actually lies heavily on the design of its capital, because pretty much everything else is similar to that of the Ionic and the Doric columns. The Corinthian really just builds off of those two orders. So at first, Corinthian columns were used inside of monuments, but once they gained popularity, they were used outside. But this wasn't until the Hellenistic period. The capital of the Corinthian column is cylindrical in shape and is completed by 2 leaves, which are most likely modeled after olive leaves, which are typically associated with royalty or coming from royalty. The lower parts are compiled also in leaves, also olive leaves, and each side of the abacus is adorned by a flower which is in the center of it on each side. The base is an Attic base, which is just a flat and rectangular shaped base. So here we have a visual of the Corinthian order. It's a lot less complex when it comes to the shaft. It's got a lot more flutes, which make it look a lot thinner. It has a base that's a little bit more developed than the Ionic, and then you have the capital, which according to an architecture online is basically just the volutes that were on the Ionic columns and like it unraveling into the leaves that are found present in the Corinthian. So just to make a comparison from the Ionic order to the Corinthian, they have similar bases, almost identical. They're both found usually on the 3rd step of a temple or a burial site, but where it really differs is, as you can see, the capital here, and then the capital of the Doric order, and then you go back to the Corinthian order, and you can see just how complex, elegant, and beautiful the Corinthian order is. So as I first talked about when I started this presentation, the reason behind me wanting to do this research was because I wanted to know more about how Greek architecture was really like in depth, and also how it relates to myth. While at first I couldn't find anything about myths that contained the classical order in depth, but then I found this myth that was about the origins of the order by a man named Vitruvius, who was popularly known as a historian at first, but then later on people realized that his history was kind of made up. So according to Vitruvius, the Doric order emerged from Peloponnese and was invented by a man named Doris. He was the son of Helen and a nymph named Pythia, who ruled Achaea and Peloponnese. Over time, the Dorian conquest took over most of Peloponnese, and thus this marked the victory with a new column type that he named after himself, known as the Doric order. The first temple to use the Doric columns was built in Argos and made in honor of Juno, or Hera, which is one of the most famous Greek goddesses. Vitruvius also added to his myth why it was that columns were made in the shape and the size of men. And he said that not having the proportions and seeking by what method they can make the columns fit to bear the weight of the structures they had to hold up, they measured a man's footstep and applied it to his height. And this is how, according to Vitruvius, columns were equal to men's body, but only the columns that were designed in Ion or Ionia. Lastly, Vitruvius has a myth about the Corinthian capital. Now, this one was specifically more interesting in the sense that it was more mythical in how it came to be. So, according to Vitruvius, he believed that the Corinthian capital came from the burial of a young Corinthian girl who died just before she became a bride. Now, this is important to the story because at the burial site of this young woman, different things were left. One of them was a basket, a goblet, and other things were also left at her burial. The basket, however, is the focus of the story because Vitruvius said that after a while, the basket was engulfed by a plant, and the plant was an olive plant whose leaves ended up overpowering the basket and branching out on the sides of it. After seeing this, an architect named Callimachus transformed the memorial into the Corinthian column, which is a hybrid of the Doric and Ionic columns. So Callimachus went to the burial site, saw the design of the basket with the leaves, and then took it and turned that into the Corinthian column / capital. One thing to say is that Vitruvius makes a point of victory, new birth, and death throughout his myths of how the classical order came to be. Now, this is popular in Greek mythology in general, where they take something mundane and then they transform that by adding supernatural elements to explain it. And that is the reason, according to Vitruvius, also, that there are no other columnar designs aside from Corinthian that are new. So, what's the point of all this? And why should you care? Because even to this day, the classical order is still being used prevalently when it comes to construction, architecture, designing of blueprints. All those things still involve classical order. And one building that you would never think to associate with this is the New York Stock Exchange building. They have absolutely no connection to Greek myth except for the building itself. Now, the New York Stock Exchange building, as you can see, is adorned by sculptures and then these columns. These columns are called Corinthian columns, just like the ones that were used by the Greeks. The New York Stock Exchange building was designed by an architect named George V. Post, and he built these columns for the New York Stock Exchange based on neoclassical architecture, and he used marble to build them, which was a commonly used element for columns by the Greeks. So you can see we have just Corinthian columns at the front, and that's pretty much the only relevance that it has to this building. But aside from this building, even within the United States, most of the Washington monuments either contain Ionic or Doric columns throughout either their structure or details or certain things, or they're made from marble. Alright, so these are just the list of the literature I use. I highly recommend looking at Sir Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture if you want to find out more, and if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. Thank you for your time and have a great summer.